Hello and welcome to the Walter Scott Prize Shortlist Spotlight. I'm Sheila Averbuck, the social media manager for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. I'm delighted to see so many of you tuning in live. I'd love to hear where you are connecting in from today, and do you have any questions for this week's guest? I am so excited to introduce Pip Williams. She has written this fantastic debut novel, The Dictionary of Lost Words. It has already picked up so many prizes, including the Indie Book Awards, Book of the Year, and that's chosen by independent booksellers in Australia. There is so much love for this book, and it has just been shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. Pip, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me, Sheila. It's lovely to be here.
How did you feel when you heard that the book had been shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize?
I know that you're asking everyone this question, and I'm sure we all feel the same in some ways, just over the moon, delighted, surprised, can't believe it. But, one of the first things I did was, you might not be surprised, but was go to the dictionary and look up the meaning of shortlist. And to be shortlisted for something essentially means to be considered. And when I thought about that, that is, I think, why it's such an important and pleasing and satisfying thing, because to be shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize means that my work, something I've loved, something I've laboured over, has been considered by others to be worthy of sitting alongside some historical fiction writers that, the whole world admires. And so it's absolutely thrilling to be part of this small group, and a little unbelievable. So, yeah, pinching myself still.
The Dictionary of Lost Words has received a huge amount of love out there from booksellers, from readers. But for people who don't know the story yet, can you give us a brief summary?
Yeah, of course. Essentially, the Dictionary of Lost Words is a fictional story about a woman called Esme, and I've woven her story through the real story of the Oxford English Dictionary. So it starts with a little girl sitting under the sorting table where all of the words for the English language are being defined, and one day one of those words falls into her lap, and the rest of the story is essentially following her experience of how the words influence her, and also how she influences the words. So that's the story in a nutshell. So
people may not all be familiar with the Oxford English Dictionary itself, or familiar with the fact that it's not just one book. Can you tell us, what is the OED? Why was it needed? What were they trying to do with this?
Okay, so before the Oxford English Dictionary, there had been lots of dictionaries, and the most famous and the most well-known was Samuel Johnson's dictionary. And Samuel Johnson's dictionary was different to many dictionaries that had come before it, in that can you hear the train going past? Sorry about that. Samuel Johnson's dictionary was a huge improvement on the dictionaries that had come before it, because it identified everyday words as well as unusual words, but it was relatively incomplete, and also it had a whole lot of idiosyncrasies as well. It was a one-man show, his dictionary, and there were many things, many definitions in it.
Oh, interesting.
Pardon?
He put it together.
Yeah, and
interesting.
Yes, he did, and it was updated by other people over the centuries. But he, if he couldn't find an example of use, he would make up a definition sometimes. So it was a little bit idiosyncratic, but much loved. But the gentlemen of the London Philological Society decided that a new dictionary needed to be compiled, and this new dictionary needed to have every word in the English language, present and past, so even words that were already obsolete. And this was the task they set themselves back in 1857, I think it was, and they started to collect the words. And the Oxford English Dictionary is different to many other dictionaries in that they didn't just provide words with a current definition. The words had a history, and they collated the history of those words and wrote that history down. So the Oxford English Dictionary is unique and beautiful and interesting because it is a history book. So you can open at any page and you can see how a word might have been used back through the centuries, and it can send you on all sorts. It's like choose your own adventure. It can send you in all sorts of directions looking for the history of a word or a meaning or our language or an experience. And that's how I found it anyway when I was doing all of the research. And it ended up being 12 volumes, sort of, huge, this thick. Yeah, that was the first dictionary, about 500,000 words and millions of sentences and definitions and senses of words.
And this sense that it was going to cover every word in the English language, it must have been especially horrifying to them when they found out that a word was missing. Could you tell us a bit about that?
I can. So this is actually where my interest in perhaps writing a novel began. So as I was reading about the Oxford English Dictionary, an interesting history in and of itself, I kept coming across this little anecdote about a word that was lost, and that word is bondmaid. And bondmaid is defined in the second edition and also in the supplements that came after the first edition as a slave girl. Quite simply, that's all it means. Bondmaid is defined as slave girl, and there's a few sentences that describe how it can be used, how it's been used through history. But this word was missing from the first volume of A and B, and it wasn't discovered missing for about 13 years after it was published. So that volume was published in 1888. And about 13 years later, in 1901, a member of the public wrote to James Murray, the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, informing him that the word was missing and shouldn't it be there. And apparently James Murray was, couldn't quite believe it, but once he came to terms with the fact that, yes, the word was absolutely missing from the dictionary, he assured everybody around him that it was the one and only word that had been missing, and it was near impossible for such a thing to happen. I doubt that very much, but knowing how this project was undertaken, but that was the line that they took, and to this day, bondmaid, I think, is the only word that has been lost accidentally from the dictionary.
So we have in the story, we have Esme, who's the daughter of one of the dictionary makers. She's under the table. The slip of bondmaid comes into her possession. She starts to collect it, doesn't she? And tell us where this word ends up.
Yeah, so this little slip of paper, because I should tell everybody that actually the words were very tangible things. James Murray, I think, when he took over the editorship of the Oxford English Dictionary, the work sped up quite a lot. And he came up with the idea of crowdsourcing this project. And I think of it as one of those first crowdsourced projects. So he sent out instructions and requests to the public through periodicals and journals and so on to essentially collect examples of how words are used in text. And so people would send in slips of paper about the size of a postcard with the word at the top, a sentence below, and they'd attribute it to the text that they'd found it in. So it could have been, Dickens' Great Expectations and a sentence that uses the word that they were interested in. And thousands of these slips of paper came into the scriptorium, every week. Yeah, which was a garden shed, essentially, in the front garden of James Murray's house. And that's where the lexicographers and assistants would gather and collate these words and provide definitions for them. And so all the words were on slips of paper, and also the definitions that the lexicographers wrote were on slips of paper attached to the words that they were defining. And one day in my novel, because nobody knows how bondmaid went missing, it's a mystery. And that's a little bit of gold for a novelist, that gap, that real gap in history where nobody knows. It's a mystery that a novelist can can imagine themselves into. And so this slip of paper slips off the end of the sorting table. My character, Esme, is under the sorting table. She's about 4 years old at this stage. She's being as quiet as a mouse and staying out of the way. And that word ends up in her lap. And at 4, she can't read it, but she knows it's a treasure. She knows that she probably shouldn't be hanging on to it, but it's come to her and she does hang on to it. And it ends up in a trunk, which the maid from the big house, Lizzie, and the big house is James Murray's house, the maid keeps under her bed, and she gives the trunk to Esme to store her treasures. And so this word, which is a treasure, goes into the trunk, and that's where it stays.
The idea that the trunk is not under her own bed, but under the bed of the maid. And this maid, she's not terribly much older than Esme, is she? That really interested me. And this relationship between Esme and Lizzie goes right through the book. Lizzie's not just the keeper of Esme's lost words or word collection. She's much more of that. Talk a bit about that relationship.
Absolutely. Lizzie is actually probably only about 8 years older than Esme. She's a child herself. So when Esme is 4, Lizzie's only about 12. But she has come to work as a servant in the big house, and that was not an uncommon thing in the 19th century for young girls to be in service to a family, and often for the rest of their lives, if their circumstances didn't change. And Lizzie's
think of
it. Exactly. and in fact, Lizzie, you can read this book in many different ways. The word bondmaid is an important word throughout the book. It has a story arc of its own. And like a character, it changes, in a good story, things happen to characters and they change because of the interactions that they have. For me, the word bondmaid was just like one of the human characters, and it changes when it interacts with people. It changes when it is on the tongue of Lizzie. It changes when it's on the tongue of Esme. It means different things to the two of them. But for me, one of the bondmaids of this story, of course, is Lizzie. She's literally a bondmaid. She fits the dictionary definition quite well. While she's not a slave, she's bonded to the Murray family in this fiction. Lizzie, I don't know whether a Lizzie really existed in real life for the Murrays, but I know that Ada and James Murray had 11 children and they were a middle-class family, and I suspect that there was more than one servant in that house helping it to run smoothly. So while her name probably wasn't Lizzie and she didn't have the characteristics of my character, it was a typical thing for those times for a servant to be in the household. And because Esme doesn't have a mother and her father brings her to work, Lizzie often has charge of Esme, and she becomes quite an important person in Esme's life. She guides Esme, she looks after Esme, she feeds Esme, she clothes Esme. They develop a very, very strong bond. Mm.
We have a question from one of the viewers. Penelope asks, she loved the relationship between Lizzie and Esme. She says, do you feel that the relationship between them is realistically drawn? She says it really seemed realistic to her, the way you put it in the page.
I hope it is. What I know, it's actually, this is interesting. My mum grew up in Brazil. My mum is now in her late 70s, but her childhood was in Brazil, and she was brought up by servants in her early childhood. It wasn't unusual for this to happen in many middle-class families where servants had charge of the children and became very close to them. In fact, my mum spoke Portuguese better than she spoke English, and English was the language of her mother. but Portuguese was the language of the servants. So that's an example of how close they were. I think it was quite common for children who were in the care of servants or, bondmaids, nannies and so on, to have very close relationships with those women. And in Esme's circumstances, as I said, she hasn't got a mother of her own either. And so the women that she adopts, in a way, they take on many of the roles that a mother might ordinarily fill. Yeah. So I think it is quite true to life.
Anyone else watching, if you have a question for Pip, please do let me know. At the moment, I'd like to ask Pip, would you like to do a reading?
I'd love to. I'll give you a little bit of background. So it's a very short reading, but the Dictionary of Lost Words also spans not just the history of the Oxford English Dictionary, but it also, by necessity, follows the suffrage movement in the United Kingdom. And this is quite a way into the book. Esme is a young woman, and the suffragettes have just started to be jailed for some of their activities, their militant activities. And not only have they started to be jailed, some of the suffragettes have started to protest their imprisonment by going on hunger strike. And after a little while, 3 women in Winson Green Jail are force-fed. And this becomes quite an issue in the newspapers. And Esme has just read this in the Times. So it's just a short reading. The Times of London gave the women in Winson Green more column space. Tilda wasn't one of them. Not this time, I thought. Charlotte Marsh was the daughter of artist Arthur Hardwick Marsh. Laura Ainsworth's father was a respected school inspector. Mary Lee was the wife of a builder. This was how the women were defined. Bondmaid. It came back to me then, and I realised that the words most often used to define us were words that described our function in relation to others. Even the most benign words, maiden, wife, mother, told the world whether we were virgins or not. What was the male equivalent of maiden? I could not think of it. What was the male equivalent of Mrs., of whore, of common scold? I looked out of the window towards the scriptorium, the place where the definitions of all these words were being bedded down. Which words would define me? Which would be used to judge or contain? I was no maiden, yet I was no man's wife, and I had no desire to be. Thank you.
I love that. I love that reading. And as I was reading the book, I was thrilled by this idea. I was always a dictionary lover myself. I could easily just read the dictionary and go, as you said, from one to the other to the other. I was a very strange 10-year-old. But anyway, as I'm reading the Dictionary of Lost Words, I'm starting to think this is impossible what they're trying to do. They're trying to capture all of the English language in a set of volumes. And language is not a static thing. It keeps developing. And if they require textual reference for the words, and these textual references are going to be, respectable white men who have written respectable things that were published, then how much are we missing? It's by necessity, the OED is going to be missing much of history, including women's history. And the fact that Esme does this creates a dictionary of women's words. And as you said, the people in her life become, the different roles of mother, I thought was absolutely brilliant. From Mabel in the market to Tilda, the suffragette, to Lizzie, who's always by her side. We nearly have all of the personae of being a woman surrounding Esme, but it's not in the dictionary, is it? It's not going to make it into the dictionary.
Yeah. That's right. And actually, that's exactly, besides the little nugget of mystery in the word bondmaid, what drove me to write the story were actually 2 questions. The first was, do words mean different things to men and women? And if they do, is it possible that we've lost something in the effort to define the English language? Because just like you, I realised that for a word to make it into the dictionary, it had to have been written down. And then I realised, now this is essentially a Victorian era undertaking. The last words were defined in 1928. If you look at the literature, if you look at the shelves in the Bodleian Library at any of those times, 90% of the books are going to be written by men. And not just any old man, they're going to be written by educated middle class and upper class men. And so by any standard of research practice, and my background is as a social scientist, a social researcher, the thing that struck me was that the method was flawed. If they wanted every word in the English language, if they wanted to represent the language of all English speakers, they had limited themselves by choosing only words that could be written, that had been written down. Now, I understand actually that as with lots of research and lots of projects like this, sometimes you are necessarily limited because it's difficult to collect evidence in other ways. It would have been possible, of course, to collect words from people who didn't normally write those words down, but that's not what happened. And because that's not what happened, I do believe that much was probably lost from that documentation of the English language. The people who were writing the books were not necessarily in the birthing room. They weren't necessarily in the kitchens and the sculleries and the coal mines. And so something would have been lost. Having said that, and, again, you mentioned this as well, the English language in particular is incredibly robust, but incredibly, it evolves. It's incredibly dynamic. And the lexicographers of the day, and James Murray, understood this. I think they understood that the Oxford English Dictionary was only ever playing catch-up to the language that was being used. They started collecting words as soon as they'd published A and B. They started collecting words beginning with A and B for a supplement. So they knew that the dictionary would be forever evolving. And that's exactly what is happening. But, there are lessons to be learned, though, from history, as there always is. It's something that I love about historical fiction, is that it sometimes highlights those things that we need to pay attention to in the present and in the future. And for me, one of the things that writing this book, I suppose, highlighted for me was we need to pay attention to whose words we value. And today, especially in Australia, but it may also be happening in the UK, there are many dialects probably around the UK that are fading, where the last speakers, will be dead soon. And in Australia, we have lost many, many, many Indigenous languages because the words were shared in story, in oral storytelling. They were never written down. The languages in Australia that we do have are the languages that where words were written down by missionaries. So that's the case in Adelaide, where I live. Kaurna language, which is the local Aboriginal language on the Adelaide Plains, is reviving now. It's a wonderful time for the Kaurna language because German missionaries wrote down many hundreds of Kaurna words, and from those words, Kaurna people today are rediscovering their language and learning it and speaking it and teaching it to their children. But those words were lost otherwise because they weren't written down, and it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy.
When we lose words, we lose a description of reality. And there's that scene where is Esme asking Lizzie, why do you do embroidery? And Lizzie says something like, it kind of proves I exist because I'm leaving my mark. And there are such interesting parallels between the Dictionary of Lost Words and actually Walter Scott himself. I'm sitting here thinking of this. He made his name originally by going through the borders and capturing the oral history and the songs and the ballads that weren't being written down. And that catapulted him to stardom. Of course, he was very, the exciting personality and very charismatic. But because he had done this thing, this bit of lost Scotland that was going to be lost, he was lauded. Of course, it's his 250th birthday this year, which we are celebrating. And tell us about the other absolutely uncanny connection between him and your book.
I know, I was so thrilled when I was shortlisted for the Walter Scott Prize, and I've watched all of your interviews so far with the shortlisted authors. And one of the things, that I feel like I just have to admit to everybody is that I didn't learn about Walter Scott at school. So unfortunately, whether it's because I'm Australian, though I do know that there are 2 other Australians on the shortlist who do seem to have come across Walter Scott in their education. I must have just gone to a worse school. I don't know. But having said that, Walter Scott is central to this book, because the word bondmaid, so I had the pleasure and privilege of going to the archives in Oxford at Oxford University Press, and going through the archives and looking at the slips, the original slips, the original proof pages. Yes. It was extraordinary. And, they're all written, so many of them are written on sort of uniform pieces of paper, but others are written on the back of shopping lists, or some people have cut out pages from books and just underlined the sentence where a word was used, or, they're so idiosyncratic and real and varied and beautiful. And to be able to hold them and examine them was extraordinary. But some of the slips that I managed to get my hands on, quite literally, were the slips for bondmaid. So this word that went missing, the slips are actually in the archives, the original slips. And I held them all, I examined them, I've got photograph proof of them. I wish I could show you. And one of those slips, if I can read it, I don't know it off by heart, but the word is bondmaid. The sentence that shows how the word bondmaid is used is this: "To Ronald's bower I brought thee, like a paramour or bondmaid at her master's gate." And that was written in 1814 by Walter Scott in the narrative poem The Lord of the Isles. And in my fictional version of the letter that was sent to James Murray about this missing word, bondmaid, because in fact the letter, as far as I know from my research, but talking to the archivist, the letter itself doesn't exist anymore. There's just reference to the letter. So we don't know what was in the letter necessarily. And so I have fictionalized the letter, and so Walter Scott plays a pivotal role in my story, because the member of the public was reading Lord of the Isles and came across the word bondmaid, and Walter Scott puts a hyphen between bond and maid. And the author of this letter, this fictional letter, thought that it should be a single word. And so that becomes the pivot on which my entire book rests. And
fantastic.
And so when and the other thing about Walter Scott is that one of the things that he used to do was weave fact and fiction. So The Lord of the Isles is a story about Robert the Bruce, and he weaves a romantic fiction through this story and through some of the history that he knows. And that's exactly what the Dictionary of Lost Words does. And it's exactly what so many of the books on this shortlist do. They weave fact and fiction, and it just makes history a far more accessible thing to a reader. But the other thing that I'm sure that it does is that fiction essentially is like, it gets into the gaps that history leaves out. It explores those shaded places. It speaks between the lines, and And it helps us think, I think, more clearly and more in a much more balanced way about the past and therefore the future.
Interesting. We have a few questions coming in. We're almost out of time, but I have to ask you these. We have a question from Richard Scott. It says, could I ask, if it hasn't already come up, how Pip picked on the school near Melrose and only a few stones throw from Walter Scott's home at Abbotsford?
Oh, what serendipity. There we go. I didn't know that it was a stone's throw away from Walter Scott's birthplace, did you say? Oh, sorry.
He built a beautiful home at Abbotsford with his writing money.
Well, I mean, I just think that's a bit of serendipity. That's beautiful to know, because I didn't know that before. And I just picked it for no particular reason, except that I know that James Murray and my character, my Esme's father, they both come from Scotland. And so I wanted there to be this Scottish connection that Esme has, and she's sent to Scotland because it's near where her aunt lives. But other than that, I made up the school. I didn't make up the place, but I did make up the school.
Oh, it's so funny. We have a couple more questions. Louise asks, how do you keep research at bay when you're writing fiction? So much fascinating material, but you can't include it all. So how do you decide?
Oh, look, it's actually it's difficult at first, but if you let the story decide what history needs to go in, then it becomes easier. So I did enough research so that I understood the context really well, but not so much that I wanted to get every bit of interesting detail into the novel. I understood it enough to start writing. And then once I started writing, the story told me what I needed to know. So, for instance, I needed to know a little bit about Cauldshiels because that's where Esme goes to school. And so I do some research on that. In fact, do you know what? Esme wrote a lot of this because as she grows up, certain words become important to her because of the time of life she's going through. So as she goes through her period, through puberty, and she gets her period, she wants to understand what's happening to her. Now, because she hasn't got a mother to ask, and when she asks her father, he gives her some sort of boffin response that's slightly uncomfortable and awkward and incredibly useless. The place she turns to throughout her life to understand herself and the world is the scriptorium. It's the pigeonholes with all of those words which contain all of the meanings of everything as far as she's concerned. She turns to the scriptorium and to those slips for the meaning of things. Sometimes the words let her down. Other times they tell her what she needs to know. Other times they confirm things for her. But all along the way, it was Esme that was deciding which words I needed to look up in the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary at the State Library of South Australia, where they have a beautiful set of dictionaries. And it's those words in a way that propel the story forward. And it's history as well, the suffrage movement. I had to incorporate aspects of history and think constantly, what would Esme be doing, thinking, feeling at this moment in time, either in her life and role in the scriptorium or as a woman growing up during the suffrage movement.
And the period that you chose was so rich for history. I'm reading along and I'm like, oh no, here comes World War I. Oh no, there's even more tragedy is going to strike these people. But were you always drawn to this period, or was it the making of the OED that focused you on this late Victorian, early 20th century?
It was the OED. Absolutely. I didn't think of anything else. And it's only once I started doing the research that I realised I had no choice but to think about the suffrage movement and World War I. Mm-hmm. They were a bonus, if you like, but the research for those things happened when they became relevant to the story. And in that way, I think you lessen the torture that might be involved with researching historical fiction. If you let the story take the lead, if you let the research take the lead, I think you create a whole lot of drama for yourself, but you also might not write a clear story.
Do you have any final words of advice for the young Walter Scott Prize writers? They're writers 11 to 19. They enter the Young Walter Scott Prize every year. We'd love to know if you have any advice for them.
I do. And the advice is really just, I suppose, following from my experience. I loved writing this book, and it got written because I loved it. And I loved it because I was curious. I didn't know the answers to those two questions I posed at the beginning. Writing this book helped me to answer those questions. So the first thing I would say is write about what you're curious about. You know, the thing that elicits a question in your mind that you want to answer. But also in terms of historical fiction, the history is only half drawn. And as fiction writers, we can draw the other half. And I think that's our job, actually, as historical fiction writers very often, is to draw what has not been drawn by the historians.
Thank you so much, Pip. I could happily sit here for another 2 hours and speak to you, but we are almost out of time. To all of you who have tuned in live, thank you so much. If you'd like to find out more about Pip's work, please go to her website. That's www.pipwilliams.com.au. If you want to keep track of what else we're doing at the Walter Scott Prize, just follow that hashtag on social media. Or the best way to keep track of us is to subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find a growing library of chats like this one with Pip, with some of the finest historical fiction writers working there today. Thank you so much again, Pip, for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And, you know, good luck, everybody, in 2021. I hope it's a better year than last.
Me too. All right. Thank you so much. And everyone watching, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.